think recording's happening. So welcome. This is Config Enforce your config for seamless deployments and DX wins. My name is Laventure. I'm with Consensus Enterprises. Thanks for coming. Just quickly, I want to take a moment to acknowledge I personally live and work and care for the lands and waters in Guelph, Ontario, traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Attawandaronk, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And I'm a settler here and trying to take responsibility for the land that many peoples have been taking for a long time. Here in Ottawa, we're in Algonquin, Haudenosaunee, and Mohawk territory, and highly recommend these websites as a good resource to get familiar with what territories you're in, what treaties apply, and so on. For myself, my name is Laventure. I use he or they pronouns. These are some of the intersectional labels that apply. And in terms of Drupal, I've been doing Drupal for a fairly long time. I first started building sites in Drupal 4.6. Realized I might never build a login system again, and never looked back. I've been fairly involved in the community for a lot of years. Been to a bunch of Drupal cons and camps and so on. The Agre project, Agre 3 and Agre 5 I've been involved with. And here at Consensus, a lot over the last few years, our work has kind of converged towards this idea of treating Drupal as an application framework. Config Enforce is kind of a piece of that puzzle. Consensus itself, we're just a small team of web professionals. We envision a more just world, so we're working to build ethical, responsible, inclusive IT and an industry to match. Trying to make open and responsible tech accessible. So just quickly, thanks for being here. Thanks to the organizers for making it possible for us to be here. I really enjoyed coming to camps and talking to people in person, so I'm excited to be here. So Config Enforce, here's a summary of what we'll cover today. A very brief history of how production deployments have gone. We'll talk a little bit about Drupal as an application framework, as I say. Look at the config management initiative 2.0 that was sort of started shortly after Drupal 8 launched with config management as a core piece. And we'll talk about where Config Enforce came from, what it does for us, and then I'll get into a bit of a demo so I can show you how it works. So, production deployments. This will be very brief. Back in the day, we had, before Drupal 8, we used to ship giant mysqldump files around from developer's machine to developer's machine, and then hope that it was close enough to production to be useful. And then if we wanted to ship changes into production, we would, best case, write a hook update script and maybe even test it in our local environment to make sure that it was going to do the things that we wanted to do without breaking other things and so on, right? Everything was just in the database, right? We had these giant dump files, like I say, hook update functions. Along came Pantheon and similar workflows that gave us, an easy means to have a dev, test, live kind of production flow. But we still had a lot of the sort of challenges. It's still a little bit of a pain to write hook updates, for example. We also have feature modules in Drupal 7, which are kind of interesting in the sense that they're sort of a precursor to config management, right? It introduced the idea of being able to export certain pieces of config into a file that's essentially code that we can version the same way that we do custom modules and so on, right? And then be able to sort of pull them in. Usually when I mention features modules, anybody who has worked with them lets out a groan because they were kind of a pain to work with, right? Config management in Drupal 8 makes this a lot better by sort of doubling down on this idea of exportables, right? Being able to export most config things into a YAML format is really useful. Most importantly, right, the thing that would happen regularly even in Drupal 8 for us, honestly, is this sort of situation where something's changed in production. Some administrator or content editor has the permission to change the site slogan, and now when I push an update that changes the home page that's in that same config, I've clobbered the production value of the slogan that the editor put in there, right? So with config management, a lot of this became a lot easier. Right now we can sort of import, export these YAML files, and everything is nice. And so now we just have these giant config YAML directories, great big directories full of config that nobody really knows what's in there entirely, and we're sort of shipping them around a lot like the mysqldump days, right? We still have to write hook update functions for a lot of situations. If I need to turn on a module, or if I need to change something in an entity or something like that, right? We gained config split, which is very popular out there, and I think has a lot of interesting kind of features in it. As far as I can tell, and I'd be glad to be proven wrong if anybody's doing different things with it, most people use config split to set up environment indicators so that they know when they're on their dev site, and like turn off mail in their dev environment, and not a whole lot else, right? I think that there's potential in the way config split works to sort of take chunks of config and treat them differently, but for the most part that seems to be the use case. The other challenge in Drupal 8 with config management is that there's not really necessarily a clear line between what we would consider config and what we would consider content, right? So Drupal itself makes a clear distinction on what it considers content and config, but for example, taxonomy terms that might form the basis of a structure in my site, menu items, right? Drupal considers those to be content. But in a lot of situations, I would prefer to think of those as a structure, as configuration for the site that makes it work, right? And still we have this problem of clobbering production values. So a brief aside, like I say, at Consensus we've had a vision of building software products with Drupal for a long time, and so we've been kind of building up tools and techniques to get us there. So we tend to end up working with a lot of sites that have very complex behavior, workflow systems for publishing academic papers that have lots of different reviewers involved at different stages along the way. We need to have that be testable and know that it's not going to regress. So we tend to treat that kind of thing, like I say, even if it's just one site that we're ever sort of deploying in production, we'll treat it as an application with an install profile that we can repeatedly install in a CI or in a local environment and run our test suite against, so that we know this complex workflow ECA setup where rules are supposed to fire and so on is all working properly, even as we add new functionality. Right, so we tend to use a lot of CI and CD to run our test suite to make sure that things are working properly, and that will do a full install of the site in CI to then sort of test that baseline functionality. Right. The other thing that we tend to do, and again sort of taken from the features modules thing, is sort of group things into logical units. So that idea of just having like one giant directory full of config YAMLs is kind of unappetizing, because like I say, it's never clear what's in there necessarily, right? You've exported the entirety of the config in your site, and maybe you only need a third of that to actually get the functionality you want, and everything else is just defaults, right? So, like I say, shortly after Drupal 8 was released and config management was clearly sort of a big success, this CMI 2.0 initiative kind of started, and as far as I can tell is sort of still ongoing at a low grade several years later, right? So this was sort of 2015, 2018, I guess. 2015 was 8.0. So Angie Byron started this thread linked here on Drupal.org to sort of collect ideas of what people were experiencing working with config management in Drupal 8, what kinds of features they found were missing, what kind of workflows that they were using it for, those kinds of things. What contrib modules were starting to emerge from that process. It's still a really interesting thread to read. I went back to it recently to kind of see how things had evolved, and it doesn't seem like there's been a whole lot of movement since. And in fact, sort of doing another kind of survey of the ecosystem, there really doesn't seem to be a whole lot more config stuff than a few years ago when we started config force. So we have the venerable config filter and config split. config split sits on top of config filter. That's what sort of lets you divert different types of config to different places, right? We have config ignore, similar thing built on config filter. Config override, again, similar kind of idea, right? Where you can sort of take over a bit of config. There's an interesting module called config develop, which will sort of automatically export config onto disk for you. And config enforce leverages this functionality. And then we have stuff like config actions. I saw a really interesting talk earlier about the evolution of config actions. It actually existed back in 2018 or whatever when we were looking at this. It's become a core API in Drupal. I think in 10 it landed there, and it's also a really interesting model. There's another one here called config synchronizer, which has this sort of idea of sort of taking a snapshot of your config before and after, and then sort of building a patch to go back and forth between, so that then you ship this patch and it sort of fires along the lines of a hook update to make the change to your config that you wanted, right? When we sort of looked at this, none of these sort of tools really addressed the problem we were facing at the time, which was this idea of config drifting in production, right? So somebody making changes in the production environment that now I have to worry about when I'm shipping new changes. Has something changed from what it looks like on my development environment? When I try to make that update, am I clobbering something? We don't know, right? And it's kind of hard to know. It's difficult to sort of tell if you're in production and you're just sort of deploying new code, whether something has changed or not. So, what we sort of landed on was maybe if we just stopped that production drift from happening, we don't have to worry so much about the flow of getting things into production. So we hit on this idea of enforcing the config in the production environment. So not allowing that editor to change the slogan or whatever, and being selective about it. Maybe you do want them to be able to change the slogan, and that you're not going to ship something to update system.site or whatever, but other things, you don't want them messing with the configuration of your views or what have you, right? So in those cases, you can simply lock them down and say, don't allow anybody to change that when it's in the production environment, and sort of force the situation that should be sort of best practice of going back to a development environment, testing the change, pushing it through the sort of testing QA process to get there, right? So what we do is essentially create a registry of config entities that we want to keep track of, that we want to enforce. So in the development environment, you sort of flag, these are configs that I care about, keep track of them. We write them to disk export them in a specific directory, and then just disable the config forms for those entities when we're not in a development mode. So we have the sort of notion of different levels of enforceability, from don't really enforce it, just sort of update it if it changes on disk, to just make the form disabled so that somebody can submit it, to don't allow any API level changes at all, right? So in our development environment, we just go around making changes, and those get auto-exported onto disk for us. They show up as Git changes, and I can simply commit them and push them up, and they will take effect in another environment when they get updated, right? So in the production environment, when I have new changes, I trigger this drush config enforce, and that will cause the module to go and look at all of the enforce config on disk and say, are there any changes here to any of these things? If so, re-import them to get those updates. So the way the module is structured, or the project is structured, is we actually have two modules. One is designed specifically to be in your production environment. Config enforce itself is the one that does that disabling and sort of making sure that you can't change configs. And then config enforce devel is the sort of other half of that for when you're in a development environment. We split it into two modules sort of for security reasons, so that the config enforce devel can just not be installed in your production environment, right? You just never have it there in the first place. You don't even compose or install it there. but you turn it on in your development environment so that you can do things, right? So the config enforce devel module gives us a UI, which will be the bulk of my demo here momentarily, to allow you to sort of set those registrations to what configs you want to enforce. As I say, we leverage that functionality I mentioned in config devel to do the auto import export. So by default, config devel will do that. You have to sort of go to an admin interface and tell it, these are the configs that I care about. So Christopher wrote a patch for config devel that adds some hooks to it that will let you register via a hook which configs you care about and you want it to export. So config enforce devel implements those hooks that will say, all of these configs that are in my registry that my user told me that they wanted to enforce, auto export those for me. So anytime you save such a config devel actually kicks in and does that writing to disk for us. By the way, if anybody knows a maintainer of config devel, I would love to chat with them so we could get that patch committed. It's working great. Anyway, so as I say, config devel writes to disk, and then we carry on from there. There's some trickery that we do behind the scenes here. It turns out that there are lots of different ways of exposing a particular config entity or config object from Drupal on the admin interface. And because of that, it's somewhat tricky for a module like config enforce to tell on a given admin page what is the config object that is associated with this page. If I'm on the site settings page, how do I know that system.site.yaml is the relevant config object for that? There's no direct connection between that page and the config object, which is a little bit counterintuitive, and there are lots of ways of making that connection, right? There's a whole number of techniques that you can use. So the sort of core of what we do is this sort of gnarly piece of code where we use PHP introspection to determine if a form has a config object associated with it, and then pull it out on that basis. So it's a little bit gnarly, as I say, and over the years of sort of building config enforce, we've found various sort of edge cases where it doesn't work. So around 10.2, for example, we changed the way that field settings forms work. So if you add a field, it used to be two different forms that you would go to, one for the field storage and one for the field instance. And in 10.2, those collapsed, so the field, they became the same form essentially, which meant that config enforce stopped detecting that there was a field storage config on the page, and so we weren't saving fields properly anymore. So it was like something had changed about that connection between the form and the config object itself, and so we had to sort of patch in a way to detect, oh, you're on a field settings form, this is the config object that's relevant. So I don't think an instance like that has come up very recently. Like I say, that's the last big one that I recall, but it's definitely sort of occasionally shows up where we don't correctly detect the config entity on the page. The good news about that is that there's a workaround, so we can always pick up any active config in storage if we know what it is, even if we don't detect it properly. Just a bit of a spoiler before I get into the thing. I mentioned these multiple enforcement levels, the sort of API level versus form level, etc. In fact, that sort of use case is still valuable to us, and we find it really useful. Since the first project that sort of spawned the idea for config enforce, I don't think we've run across a case where we needed the API level of enforcement. So we haven't implemented that part yet. We disable the form. If you had another way via the API to change config, you would be able to, but for the most part, that doesn't really happen, right? So, but what's interesting, is that we've discovered that this led to a really nice development workflow along the way. So the process of building a site, doing this sort of site building development activities has gotten quite a lot smoother with Config-Enforce in play. Because as I say, we sort of we stop worrying too much about what needs to be exported and just go around making changes, and Config-Enforce sort of figures out that everything I've changed is relevant and export that. And then I've sort of captured just that third of the site config that I actually really care about, that's getting me the functional differences that I need. Here's some links. You can find Config-Enforce on Drupal.org, of course, and we have a dedicated doc site for it, just to cover some of the details. Here, I think I've covered this stuff already. The 10.2 config target change, right? Some new stuff that's upcoming. There's a new, I mentioned the config actions API, and config transformation events went into core recently. So this is sort of yet another way of handling config in core that I suspect Config-Enforce eventually will want to sort of hook into to at least notice those kinds of changes and so on, right? And in fact, the venerable config filter on the project page there is now actually recommending config transformation events as the way to do what it has always done. Okay, let's jump into a demo. I'll show you this page. You can put that up there. Okay, I got it all in. Okay. So, if I can get up there. So, I'm just starting from scratch here. I'm just gonna use a couple of shortcuts that I had to start off a site. This is just literally gonna initialize a repo with a site name that I give it. Another one of the tools that we use in terms of this application framework, Drupal as an application framework, is this thing called DrumKit, which gives me makefile targets to do a lot of the common things that I do. So that is gonna get DrumKit for me. One of the things that DrumKit is really good at is just kicking off a Drupal project for me. So again, I'm just giving it a little shortcut to kick this off. This is gonna sort of bring up like our boilerplate Drupal site. It's got, like I say, some make targets for building, installing, testing the site, and it sets up a DDEV environment. It sets up Chrome drivers so you can see your JavaScript tests run and that kind of thing. Like I say, just a sort of stock local dev environment with sort of all the standard tools that we use. And I should have run this earlier, so it was sitting in my cache. Here we go. Come on, we can do it. Okay. There we go. So then from here, I'll bootstrap DrumKit. I'll do a series of targets here to, again, I'm just building the site that's going to do a composer install for me, a drush site install, and then just kick off my tests to make sure that everything's kind of sane as a starting point. While that goes, I will. That might be too fast. So there goes my composer install, my site install. So stock Drupal, right? Now, if I log in here, you see my standard stuff. What I will do from here, oh yeah, sorry, so there are my tests run too, right? I'm just gonna do a couple more setup things. Init config enforce is my shortcut to just get config enforce in place. Like I said, because of that config devel patch, we ship with composer.json in the project that refers to that patch, which means you need to enable patching at the root of your project in order for that installation to work and actually apply that patch. So there's a couple of steps, primarily just enabling patching in your root composer.json so that when you pull in config enforce devel, it will patch config devel properly for you. But now with this in place, I should be able to reload here. Oh, sorry, I got to install it first too. So I'm gonna turn on the config enforce devel module, which, as you see, it turns on config enforce and config devel as well. And that gives me this enforce configs menu up here. That's what shows me that config enforce is in play. And this is sort of our main interface screen to interact with it. So, well, to be honest, I don't look at the screen a whole lot, but it's sort of the main settings page for config enforce. So down here we have a list of all of the enforced configs. I can change the sort of default settings. So the target module, that's the place where my config is going to get exported to. The directory, whether it's going to be an install or optional, and which enforcement level I'm going to choose, right? Which, as I say, typically we pick allow form and API updates, but it actually is just disabling the form. Sorry. Not here. What am I looking for? So this screen will let me change en masse. If I was to select one of these from down here and change one of these settings, it will update everything in the list, so sort of VBO style, right? I can also hit the settings link over here and update any of those settings in this context. The defaults that I was just talking about are actually over here. This interface changed on me. And here's, again, those three fields, and here I'm just setting the defaults. So when I jumped over it, but when I first installed config enforce and I come to this page, it will create this default target module for me. It needs somewhere to put that registry and whatever configs that you start enforcing. So it just creates a basic module in your sort of modules custom and enables it as a target module so that config enforce can write into it. If I want more of those, like I say, in our case, we tend to sort of break them down a little bit more logically, so we'll tend to have multiple of them. I can create a new one here, give it a name, and it will do the same thing, essentially. Spin up a new info.yaml and a registry. So the registry that I talked about, right, where we list the configs that we are caring about, is a config itself that config enforce manages, and so that's this first one here. It's literally just a listing of the config objects that we've registered for enforcement. We keep track of the name of it, a hash of it, so that we can determine if it's changed to update it later, and these settings about where it lives and what enforcement level, right? Where was it going? The default target module is intended to just kind of bootstrap you. If you just want to dump everything that you care about into one module, it serves perfectly well for that. But you can replace it, add your own, shift your configs into it as you like. and turn it off and get rid of it entirely if you want, right? So that's our basic settings. I'll come back here in a sec, but let me just show you sort of a little bit how this works. If I go to my classic example is this site.settings, right, or system.site. If I add a slogan in here, right, and I'll point out the config.enforce field group up here is showing me that it's enabled and that it's detected this system.site config on here. So as soon as I save, it's going to enforce that for me. We have a setting that was introduced recently that just enforces by default. So we just sort of assume that if you're going to a config page and you're changing something, you probably want to enforce that, right? You can disable that if you want to sort of explicitly do things, but as it stands, it will just sort of automatically save enforcement settings based on those defaults that you configured anytime you change anything. So it means that, like I say, from a site building perspective, I set this up and I turn it on, and then I just kind of go around building things, right? I create my views, I create my content types, I add fields, et cetera, and all of those are kind of just quietly getting saved to disk behind the scenes. So if I flip back here and I do a get status in here, I haven't added anything in here yet, but you'll see. Just add it like this, right? Here's my registry. It's now got two entries in it, one for system.site and one for the registry itself, right? And if we come down here, there's my system.site.yaml with my new slogan in it, right? Similar thing I can show you, like if I go to create a content type, right? And I maybe want to add a field on it, right? Maybe it's a date and time field. So again, here you see the field set showed up there, so it's detecting that this field can be enforced, and once I've saved it, we'll see that it has been enforced. So the field turns green there to show me that it's being enforced for me. And again, right, if I come over here now, we'll see right away, aha, here's the registry changed, and here's a bunch of new configs for that content type in that field, right? Display modes, views, right? Basically anything that has a config object, assuming that config enforce sort of correctly detects it on the config form, is just going to get automatically written to the target module that I specified. In a context where I maybe have multiple ones in play, a site where it's like a number of different content types and they're all fairly big and complex, we'll usually have a target module for each one, right? So if I'm working on content type A, I'll go and set my default target module to be that content type A target module, go around, make my bunch of changes, and they'll all kind of get written into the right place for me. Then I move on to working on B, change the default, and so on. Yeah, but
can you expand on those things?
Oh yeah. So these are showing me the settings that got picked up, right? That the target module it's going to, the config directory, and so on. And if I want to change something here, I should have actually made a second module, right? But if I had another target module here, for example, so say I've switched over to working with content B, but my default is still going to content A, I can just fix that by changing it here, resaving, and config enforce will shift it over into the new target module for me. Move the registry entry, and we're good to go. So this is actually an example where there's two config objects on the page, right? This was the result of that collapsing of the field settings form. So we detect both of them and save them kind of both at the same time. There are other cases where that happens as well, where you'll see sort of a big list of them show up, right? Okay, what else do we want to show? Let me actually come back up here. So now back on this page, right, you can see I've got a bunch of new enforced configs. If I now add a module, I'll call it second target. So again, config enforce will create that module for me, and I think I've skipped. Yeah, so our target modules are listed down here. So you can see it's selected second target and made it a target module, so that we know that it's a location. If I have another custom module that I've created on my own through other means or whatever, I can make any of them target modules just by selecting them here and shifting them over, right? So with that second thing in place, if I come over to enforce configs now, and I want this this system.site to move over, I can pick it here, save, right, and then we'll see on disk now it's moved into, well, I haven't added it here, but you see it's been removed there, and it'll be added in that folder. Yeah. So maybe I won't bore you with all of the more details, but as I say, any config basically works like this. The flip side of it now, right? If I commit all of this stuff and I push it, I don't have a production environment to show you, but right, I would simply pull this config into that environment and run like a. Typically, we would do this sort of in an automated way, along with like a drush.db or whatever, sort of doing the auto updates. This will say, look at all the registry files on disk, and if anything has changed in from the production environment, then re-import that, right? So that hash file that's in the registry itself is just a hash of the config object, the content of it, so that we can easily sort of say, this hasn't changed anything, so can carry on, right? Or the hash is different, so now I need to import it, sort of thing. I think I'm out of time. Any questions? Great. Go off and use config enforce. That's great. Thanks for coming, folks. I'll leave it there.
Do you have any like environment settings so you can say like enforce this on one environment?
We don't. I was thinking about this morning about could we do the equivalent of config split with config enforce? Yeah, I think I haven't tried this. Christopher might have an idea, but I don't think there's any reason you couldn't use config split alongside config enforce, and just sort of enforce your sort of split stuff alongside it. Basically, yeah. Is that your thinking?
We're sort of trying to figure out how to integrate config split. What we generally do is we'll have a site name _devel module that will enable things like config enforce devel and various configs specific to the that we want to have enabled in our development environment. So we'll enable modules like devel and things like that, and then we just don't enable that as part of our. It's not part of our install profile, right? So in production, that never gets turned on, but it's available to us in local dev. We're thinking of doing something comparable with product settings, right? So that we would have them turn on in production in that context. So we're kind of experimenting with how to do some of that stuff. Like right now, we're finding that we in development mode we inadvertently set everything to turn off all of our caching because we don't want that. We deployed it in production. refreshing and the site's really slow.
Yeah.
You know, so there's little things like that that we're tweaking, but you know, especially since we did the 2.0 release last year sometime, it just kind of gets out of the way entirely and just sort of just configure the site the way we want, and it more or less does everything we want. And then, you know, if we decided that, you know, oh, something is in the wrong module, we just come here and we select the ones we want and we shift them over and everything works really well there. Can you do me a favor? Just click on system.site on that. So there's actually one other piece of config that we keep, which is the URI of the config form. So from here, we have a list of all the configs. Almost all of them will have a link, and so if you click on it, it just brings you right back to that form as well. So you can, from the name of the config, you can get to the form that it's associated with, which sometimes shifts around a bit, like views, you know, depending on if you're in like a pop-up or something, views, it will sometimes save a slightly strange URL. But it really just becomes a simple part of our workflow. You don't have to think about it. By default, it'll run that enforce drush method when you clear, when you cache rebuild as well.
Okay.
So just doing a cache rebuild should be sufficient. And so even if you're running from the front end, that whole idea of locking down your production environment, it will check if any configs have changed. It will check what's on disk, and if there has been any shift, it'll re-import them from disk, right, with just a cache or a cache rebuild. You can turn that off because there's some use cases where that's not what you want, but generally speaking, that's sort of the default. So yeah, we use it on all our projects these days because it's just so convenient, and it gives us that isolation of like, you know, team A is working on these features and team B is working on these features, and they're not going to be, you know, overriding each other's changes in general because we've isolated the config.
So it wouldn't stop someone from making a config change on the product. It would override it.
Generally it will. So can you try turning off config?
Oh, yeah.
Force development
That's
so that we
what
can
I
make
should
sure
have
you
done.
what it looks like?
Yeah.
Because what it does is it makes all of the, as we'll see in a minute here, it makes all of the fields read only
Okay.
on the form. So even user one can't make changes in production. Right? That's sort of the design, the primary design rule of it.
A little more complex ones that give you configuration.
Same thing.
Yeah.
It all gets locked down. And that's been a real time saver, like in production projects where we're deploying this stuff. It just it's huge. So there these other levels. So the default is usually read only, no edits, right? Now that's over promising. That's what Derek was mentioning, is that all it's really doing is shutting down the form, which has been sufficient for us.
Sure.
There are plans, we have a feature request to basically swap out the config writer service to be read-only in production environments and stuff like that. We just haven't found that it's needed.
Yeah.
So in a higher security environment, I think we're kind of waiting for that to be a feature request from somebody who has the funds to
But mostly you're
finance.
just worried about someone clicking around too much.
Yeah.
Well, that's the use case where it gets really complicated to like getting reversions, or getting, you know, all these kind of things. And, you know, since we're relying on the code, the config being written to disk, if it's changed in production and nobody's exported it, and we're not shipping databases, which we don't, then that change is lost. So whatever that change was. So this avoids that entirely, and it makes it pretty simple. And if they need to change, say, system.site, you know, we just don't enforce it if we want to give them the right to change the slogan or whatever. But generally speaking, that works really well. And then there's all kinds of like mass functionality. Like if you find there's a config, as Derek mentioned, there's a bunch of different ways that Drupal handles config in different forms. And some of them we can't detect programmatically reliable. Right? So what we'll do there, and I think this is where Derek was going to show us here, is in the config enforce interface, there's just yeah, so if you have modules that already ship with config, you can just slurp those into config enforce. But you can also generate from active storage. And so here, if you scroll down, here's the list of all the available config that has not yet been enforced. And so you can just select some, and the upper part of this form has the target module and the other settings, right? And this will just start enforcing those configs. Once it takes ownership of a configuration, it just manages it from that end forward until you decide you don't want to enforce it. You can just turn it off. But now they're there. You'll see that those don't have any links to the config form because we imported them from active, so we don't know where it was that the form was from. But that's something that you can do. You could just select everything, right? And dump everything into your default one. It would be the equivalent of configs, or like in a config import export. Except that you also get the lockdown feature of your production.
And yeah, this is our sort of, the fallback if you end up in that situation where it hasn't detected your config properly or whatever. And yeah, like Christopher said, once it's in here, once it's sort of registered to be enforced, any subsequent changes will get picked up automatically. It's just sort of that initial detection.
Right. There's a, sorry, I really love this. There's a few things that we use. Can you go up towards the top here? There's a few things that are handy here as well. So if you go and config enforce devel settings, so there's also a deny list where we can select configs to ignore. So once we know we don't want to enforce, like if say system.settings or system.site, what we could do is just set that to be ignored, right? And then that way we're never going to enforce it unless we come back here and undo that. But that way we don't inadvertently enforce something that we
Enforced
don't
it all.
want to. Right. And there is one of the settings, if you go back up to the enforcement level, there is there's only one enforcement level that's line, and that is the read-only no updates. We're not going to shut down API changes. Allow form and API updates means that we're going to capture the config, we're going to write it to disk, so when you do a new deployment, it's going to install it. But when we do a config enforce later or a cache rebuild, it's not going to check against what's on disk and overwrite. So that's just an initial deployment, a little more like a recipe, right? Where it's just applying the config once and then not doing it. So there is a subtlety there. We don't find ourselves using that at all because we're kind of generally we're building sites that we're treating as applications. And so config becomes like a code for us. But we figure it's a use case that's viable, right? That's like the reason. So it supports all of that.
Cool. Can you scroll down a little more? Just that first block of like that. Yeah. So if you selected like one of your config changes, can that reside in two targets or is it just one target?
Just one.
Say I had feature A, feature B, and I want the same thing in both. But can you select one up?
Yeah, because the config object only exists
Right.
once in like inactive storage, right? So yeah, if it, typically in that scenario it would be like different content types or different fields. If fields are shared across content types, then what we'll do is tend to have a common module that we store those in, and then the content type separately or something.
Okay. Yeah. That is where something like a prod and dev.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where we're thinking in terms of integration.
I'm assuming it'd be pretty risky to pick a contrib module. Because the module gets updated and you lose whatever.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, well, yeah. It means, it would mean that you're basically sort of pinning the config from the contrib module where it is, right? We sort of enabled all of the possible target module, like every module that's in the system as a possible target. We sort of had the idea that contrib modules could ship with enforced configs themselves, right? So they could have their own registry that they ship with, and then sort of leverage the same mechanism. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
If
something via force config file, for example, what happens when you export?
If I change it in live or
It doesn't matter, in dev, whatever.
so in dev, any change I make to a registered config is going to automatically just get written to disk. So if I change my
No,
view
but
config,
My question is, if you don't know exactly how many files you have in config, in for config,
yeah,
and someone else who just want to export everything to us,
oh, I see.
it will, I don't know, mark somehow? those
No, it
files?
will, if you do like a standard drush config export, it's going to do what it always does and just export the whole kit and
Export
caboodle for you.
everything.
Yeah.
So if the person who doing that doesn't know that these files are overwritten, or
Sure.
forced,
Yep.
it will lose the files, right?
The config and enforce files would remain intact. It wouldn't touch them because like they're in separate modules, right?
Yeah.
The config export will go into your config sync directory.
Yeah.
Config enforce is writing into module config directories, right? So they're separate. So it's sort of just parallel, right? If you do a config export, that's going to go and do what it always does, but it won't affect config enforce. Yeah.
What would happen is if you import that